Welcome back to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source. I am Eric Paul. You can find us on the internet. Well, it's pretty much the only place you can find us at epspodcast.club. Look for us on Patreon. Look for us on Facebook, all the social media, EPS Podcast. And I'm glad today to be joined by my good friend Kris. Kris is a musician. He has, we just determined, a lot of guitars, and we've known each other for quite a while, and it seems that inevitably we always end up talking about the group that we're about to talk about today, which is the Ramones. But how you doing, Kris?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm really excited to be doing this. Yeah,
it's you'll be amazed how quickly the time goes by.
Okay.
So and it's funny because we're going to be talking about an album that came out about 42 years ago last week, and that's the fifth studio album by the Ramones, called End of the Century. And this was the album, it was the second one that featured replacement drummer Marky Ramone on it. He was actually on the album itself, and some people even say that he may have been him and Joey were the only ones actually on the recording. There's some rumors that the other band members weren't there. But just a little bit about the Ramones before we launch into it. I should just point out they are my favorite band of all time. Like, I discovered them when I was in high school at the wrong moment because they were just about to break up. I didn't know that, but it was right around 1996 that I saw them on the MTV Video Music Awards, or excuse me, the MTV Movie Awards, doing a medley of all the songs for the best hit. And I just fell in love with their simplicity. And I remember talking to my parents, who were children of the 60s. They went to high school and college in the 60s. They lived in New York City in the early 1970s and went to school there. And they had never heard of them. And I remember seeing them, like, they look like a bunch of Roy Orbisons. Like, I thought you guys would have definitely been into them, but they didn't really know them. So there's another reason I really liked them, is because they reminded me of my parents' music, and yet they were my own. Like, I could call them my own, and it was like my sound. And this album in particular, so the first three are their classic, 3-chord, 2-minute long songs. This album actually only clocks in just over a half an hour, but it's like it's the ultimate them being like the 60s, because this was produced by Phil Spector. So have you heard End of the Century?
Not start to finish. No, I'm sorry. No.
You could probably do it in the time that we're on right now. It's so fast. It even starts out perfectly with the sound of a transistor radio, and then you can hear the voice say, it's rock and roll radio, time to rock and roll with the Ramones. And so that, and it launches into Do You Remember Rock and Roll Radio, which is, such a powerful song. But
of course,
the thing that, and we don't even really have to talk about the songs so much as the cover art, because that's what I talked about with you the other day.
Yeah, you had mentioned something about the cover, and I'm really interested in that.
So as a way to, like, I go bouncing back and forth between I've noticed there's like a thread between all of my different podcasts. The last one, the one that just released yesterday, is about the movie Commando, and there's a book, Commando, Arnold Schwarzenegger's Commando, and the biography of guitarist Johnny Ramone is also called Commando. And it was a quote from him that was put up on social media about this album cover, in which he said, because they took 2 pictures, and I'm assuming they took more than 2 pictures, but they took two shots that they thought could be used for the album cover. The first one was with their iconic leather jackets on, and then the second one, which is what we know now, which is them just wearing solid color t-shirts with no leather jackets on. And the question comes up, and he said, that's the moment that we changed. That right there is when the old Ramones of the 70s really,
Ah,
were no more. And even though they continue to sound like themselves, especially live, you can definitely hear it in their recorded music and even some of their live stuff. But it's an interesting thing to consider. I love turning points in careers. I love learning about turning points in um, history in general. So that's an interesting one that he recognized even then that the leather jackets were part of their look,
mhm.
and then when they're pictured without them, does that change stuff?
That is a very that's sort of making a statement there. Yeah. How do you feel about the albums afterwards? Uh,
It's funny because just before we hit record,
mhm.
I was saying that I've always compared the first four
Yes.
Ramones records to Star Wars because it came out around the same time, late, mid 70s to late 70s, and they kind of follow that same progression of starting off very raw and this is something brand new, even
Yeah.
though it's harkening back to the old stuff. I mean, think about the original Star Wars movie. It's basically a 1930s Buck Rogers serial, just
Totally.
updated. And the Ramones' first album was it was loud and fast, but it was still 1950s rock and roll, really, you know. And then you get onto the second and third albums, and it follows that same kind of step up that the next two Star Wars movies did, introducing new things. So I think this album, End of the Century, kind of does stand out to me as like I don't want to say the Star Wars Christmas special or holiday special, but it's
Don't
along
compare
the
it to
lines maybe of like something not quite the original trilogy. It's maybe the
that.
first prequel, maybe Phantom Menace kind of thing.
Yeah, sure. Um, that's that's interesting. To see the progression of bands over time. And the directions they go in. If they had continued on sounding the way they were, I suppose people would have. Oh my goodness. Um, they would have wanted new stuff, and then you get the other half of people who you give them new stuff, and then they want the old stuff. So
Yeah.
it's there's no way to win there, but you got to progress somehow. So
Yeah, and I think this was their attempt at doing that. This particular album, and your question was, the ones that come after this. What do I think of it? And each one after this really does have its own gems. I really do like some of, and they kept themselves pretty tethered to their initial goals. It seemed to be like the kind of bearing the torch of the 60s throughout the 70s and into the 80s. And that's really the theme of that opening song I was mentioning. Do you remember
yeah,
Rock and Roll Radio?
yeah,
It
yeah,
is saying, this is like we're at the end of the decade, and it does actually match up pretty well with so the album title is kind of weird. It's like End of the Century, but it's only 1980.
yeah.
But some historians, even in the time period, kind of recognize the 80s as being the last decade of the 20th century, that the 90s were a preparation period for the next century and the next millennium. So I think that they were onto something about the lyrics to that song and the album title itself, that this was a time for change for everybody. And this is their way of kind of just, I mean, just look at the way they're looking back at us in that picture. you
Loving.
know
Yeah,
yeah, they're just kind of glaring. They're looking at us like, hey, you know
I
don't
would
even think about
probably.
forgetting about Rock and Roll Radio.
Yeah, if they were coming in my direction, I would go the other side of the street and keep.
Right.
I would skip that.
And they almost like, so why don't we start breaking this down, because I think this conversation can definitely go places once we start diving into it.
Mhm.
So the very first question that comes up when looking at the any primary source is, what material is it from and how is it made? And you're a musician, so when it comes to your material for your music, the stuff that you write yourself,
Sure, sure.
um, where is that coming from? What is the material that you base it on?
I base it on whatever I'm listening to. Honestly, I do a lot of film score type of music, but you know, if I wanted to do something like this, I would go back to their albums and listen to them again, and I would find their identity, and I would try to emulate that identity in this case,
Yeah.
So I'm not really tethered to any particular type of music, but I feel like these guys were just they were their own style of music, their own identity, that nobody has ever recaptured. Even a
Yeah.
Ramon cover band won't really get these guys.
And there's lots of them.
Yeah, I bet there are, because the songs are very simple, but that's not the point. It's not about the simplicity of the song. It's the identity of the band.
And
And
that's what's so strange about this cover, is that identity is altered just
yeah,
slightly, and I guess, we come back to that, and it seems like Johnny Ramone was onto something when he said that it was, you take away our leather jackets, and we're already changed. Even if before you listen to the record itself, it's that you're already seeing a different group, and so therefore the material isn't even what the last three albums were. So I mean, if we're just looking at the cover art, we can talk about the music in a moment. The cover art, I think, represents them pretty well, but it's still not quite the Ramones, because it's sans leather jackets that they are.
yeah,
Seeing the primary colors on their shirts, it's like simple, just like their music. But their look is, the overgrown mop tops. They got that, kind of street tough, appearance to them, as well as the name itself kind of sounds like a gang, Ramones,
yeah.
and each donning their own, the last name, like that's, and so
I love
when
that, actually.
even before you hear Joey's voice on any of their albums, you can, or any of their songs, you know who it is. Like just the opening, you can just like, that's them.
That's the thing, and that's you're talking about the earlier albums having a different kind of feel, and I imagine that they were recorded simply. I can't
Yeah.
imagine there was a whole lot of production of any kind there. Like they just plug a guitar into an amplifier, point a microphone at them, and that's their identity.
And that's where this comes in, and I think that, so we're bouncing back and forth between the cover and the album underneath the cover.
Yeah,
And in that time period, it would come out in 8-track, and it would come out, of course, in record, the actual so you're pulling, it's just a sleeve
yeah,
holding this, and inside is the vinyl, which contains the actual stuff itself. And that was made, you're right, so
the first four albums,
they were produced pretty well, but they were pretty simple because it was a simple group. So Phil Spector, the famous, Wall of Sound, Ronettes, Beach Boys, pretty much every group in the 60s in America, I'm pretty sure,
pretty much everybody. Yeah, Phil Spector.
Yeah. So he approached them when they were on tour in LA. He sought them out, and Joey, the lead singer,
of course,
being the huge music. I mean, the 60s were, music were like, that's the greatest time in rock and roll. To him, he's just like born of that stuff. He was like, yes, we need to record with Phil Spector. And so that's why the album has that sound. But does it work? So it's so funny, because you have a band that's directly inspired by the stuff that Phil Spector had done in the previous decade, but they had added so much of their own identity to it that when you try to Phil Spectorize the Ramones, it doesn't come out, because you have these nice, the clean guitars. I mean, the story goes that when they were recording for Rock and Roll High School, they spent the better part of at least a day doing the same opening guitar until he could get it right. And I mean, look at Johnny's face, the guitarist on this album. He looks like a guy that just spent a day hitting the same note over and over again.
Yeah, he does in this picture particularly. Yep.
So, I mean, it was made in such a different way than their other albums that came before it. What does this all tell us about that transitional time period between the 70s and the 80s? What does it say to you about the year that it came out, if we were using this as this album cover as a primary source of that time period?
Album cover itself? Well, I think, you know, the album cover itself is almost foreshadowing, you know,
Yeah.
to the fact that we're changing and we're actually making a statement with this photo. This photo is a representation of what you're going to hear now. It is,
yeah,
it's new. It's not going to be exactly what you're used to hearing from us. And I like, you know, the idea of, you know, the 90s being a precursor, that and them being ahead of their time in that sense. That is almost prophetic, really.
yeah. And it's almost right that they broke up when they did. And you know, some of, like, about half the band was saying, yeah, we're ready to continue on, you know, we could do this. And then the other half of the band, led by Johnny, was like, you know, I think when you get to a point where you're hearing, and I remember him saying this in one of the documentaries, like when you're seeing bands that were inspired by you inspiring other groups, then it's time to hang it up. That you're, you know, and so I mean, that's the juncture that they're at with this particular album. And I love what you're saying, that it's very prophetic. One of the songs on the album actually has a line of Doomsday is coming 1981, you know, but until things blow, I'm going to have some fun. And it's so, like, that's, I mean, from the world that they were coming from, you know, the ugliness, the sound, the noise, the you know, that do-it-yourself mentality of the late 70s, that was going to change. You know, that was going to change for them quite a bit into, you know, the 1980s, the materialistic, very, you know, get rich quick. You know, they had been waiting to try, especially Joey. He'd been really hoping, you know, they kind of saw themselves as like, any minute now we're going to get famous, any minute now we're going to be the big thing, and not being satisfied with just, you know, at that point anyway, of saying, you know, we're the best at what we do. They're like, we want to be a commercial success. And this was the album that was going to do that. And maybe that's why they took off the leather jackets, to kind of make themselves look more clean cut and ready for this new age.
It's kind of what the Beatles did. You know, they originally had leather jackets and everything, and they cleaned up their act, and you know, the rest is history. So, you know, maybe that's what they were going for as well. Like you're seeing, like they're trying to become more commercial, or more, you know, a wider audience, you know, trying to get other people on board. But
I mean, it's a very 60s look. This album cover is very 60s, and it's almost like they may have gone back in time a little bit too far for 1980. You know, because the 80s were reaching back in a lot of ways to the 50s. That was the time that people were nostalgic for by the 80s, for a number of reasons. I mean, I think about the Stray Cats. Who were huge fans of the Ramones, and, you know, had that similar mentality of, let's, you know, keep things back to basics for rock and roll, you know, simple. But on the other side of things, they were commercially successful, you know, and I think people really gravitated towards them. I remember seeing a clip of the Stray Cats, I think on American Bandstand or something like that.
Oh yeah, right.
And it just looked like a colorized version of, you know, like American Bandstand in the 50s. And even the fashions of the kids in the audience, they weren't quite as extreme as, you know, Brian Setzer and Slim Jim Phantom and the other guy who I always forget. But you know, they were very that like 50s kind of teenager thing, which, I mean, you had a president who was an actor in the 50s, you know. So it all kind of goes down from there. So yeah, I think we did a nice job of breaking this down as far as that. Now, that leads us to the next question of what was the maker's role or status in society. So there's two makers of the album.
Mhm.
I'm not exactly sure who took the picture. If it was anybody that we would know, it's given credit to Sire Records. That's the record company that the Ramones worked for. So for this one, we'll talk about the album and the subject of the photograph, the Ramones. Phil Spector, like we said, he was a huge success in the 1960s. He was a rock and roll pioneer. And the Ramones were trying very hard to climb up that ladder of in society. So in the underground rock and roll scene, they were the kings. They were the best. I mean, they were the Johnny Appleseeds of punk rock.
Yes, absolutely.
That was their game. But as far as being pop culture, they weren't quite there. What do you think was holding them back? That throughout the 70s, why weren't they on the radio as much as they should have been?
That's a good question. I'm not really entirely sure. Maybe the if we're talking about the 70s, everybody was into what, disco and stuff like that. Maybe they weren't ready for it, that type of music, because punk rock was burgeoning, in that time. Obviously the 70s was
that's the birthplace.
Yeah.
It's
and
just it.
A lot of other punk bands at the time were not on the radio either. Like you wouldn't hear, I don't know, the Sex Pistols or you might hear Joan Jett, like she was really pioneer as well. But yeah, none of those punk bands really were on the radio. I think, if I can remember correctly, it was all.
Yeah, well, they repackaged it right around this time is when they were repackaging a lot of those groups as new wave. So instead of having, so you'd have like Blondie, that same year, 1980, I think it was 80, had a couple of hits, including, and maybe it was a little bit before that they had their song Heart of Glass, which was a bona fide disco song. I mean, it's all it is, disco. And I remember seeing an interview with the Ramones on regular network TV, and they were saying, and again, as a Johnny quote, he's like, "We have our integrity." We and he's referencing Blondie, a group that they had played with. I mean, they're from the same CBGB scene, and he's like, "We have our integrity. We're not going to just record that kind of stuff." So I feel like this album was like it was like they were trying to make up for not changing their sound soon enough. And it's like, by this point, no, you guys, unfortunately, your status in society is that you're a punk group. And even if you take off your leather jackets, even if you get Phil Spector, and you start, and the songs sound that much more produced and cleaner than, a buzzsaw sound, we're still not gonna have you on the radio because you're the Ramones. Like that's just your, only live concerts for you.
The fashion probably played a huge role in it too, because they had such a unique look about them. That was also part of the identity, was the look of the band. The haircuts. The
so sort of out of time and out of place. Like they almost looked like they didn't have a time.
They came from a generation that never existed. They're
That's such a good way of putting it.
Some other way. A generation that we skipped somehow.
Like they felt that. No, that's perfectly put. I really do agree with it. Like, because I mean, we know when all of them were born. I mean, we know exactly and they grew up, and you can hear their music is definitely inspired by things, including as a reaction to dinosaur rock and roll groups that are playing 20-minute long guitar solos and the disco albums and all that stuff. It's a reaction to that. But you're so correct that and you see it with their later albums. It's almost like they just kind of come to terms with that, and they're like, we're our own thing. We'll never be and we'll be the Pied Pipers of the punk scene, and they never even looked like punks either. Most people think of punks, and as by the time you get to the 80s, mohawks and the jackets with the paint all over it, and
vicious type looking characters.
Hair
that's green and orange and purple.
So,
Yeah.
going back when I first got into the Ramones, like I said, it was from that, I saw them on MTV, and this was in the 90s.
Oh yeah, sure.
And then I saw they made a music video for I Want to Be Sedated.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting because they made that in the late 80s, but the song came out 10 years before, but it came out pre-MTV, so they hadn't made a music video for it. So I saw the music video, and it was credited, it said it came off an album called Ramonesmania, which is their like a greatest hits album kind of thing.
Yeah, sure.
Compilation. Yeah. And so I bought that, and the cover of that artwork on that is just like a compilation of its own. It's just all a bunch of memorabilia and stuff. And one of the posters on there said punk rock concert. I'm like, what? Punk rock? These guys have long hair. Like punk rockers looked like, they had, if they didn't have a mohawk, they had like short spiky hair, and they, nose rings. And, that was my perception of punk rockers back then. And I'm like, these guys are punk rock. Well, yeah, actually, young Eric Paul, that was punk rock. They're the founders of it. Like, they're the ones who made it.
Yeah.
And
I would say I would give them that as well. Like their brand of punk rock is unique. It's their own. And like I said, there are a lot of anybody can do covers of their songs, but they started something new. It was fresh. It's not like other punk bands. It's and you know what, you said something earlier too, like it's sort of a reaction in a way to the like jam bands that go on forever with the guitar solos, and it's 20-minute songs, and they have these guys have their succinct, this is a song. This is not, we're not going off into space somewhere. This is a song, just like any of those great like Motown songs or whatever, early rock and roll like Elvis or whatever. It's got a lot of those elements involved. Like it's just very, very different and very only them, I guess I could say. I would say but it really belongs to them, and the appearance of them, everything about them, only is them. I don't know how to better put
that you're so right. And even this, when they're trying to clean it up and try to make them more commercially, palatable or something, you're right. It's still it's like the Ramones are trying to be, like it's I've seen some of those cover groups, like or they call them like tribute acts, and to me it always like, because I much more appreciate the ones, because like the band I was in high school, we started out as basically a Ramones cover band because it's all I could play. I didn't know how to play. That's another reason I loved them, because I'm like, I can do their stuff. But we didn't dress up like them. We didn't, pretend to be them. And whenever I see groups do that, it always looks like they're wearing Halloween costumes.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Like I saw Beatlemania when I was younger, and I was like, that's not the Beatles. Of course,
we may have actually seen that at the same time. Was it in Prescott Park in Portsmouth?
It was.
I was there. I saw that. I was there in the background.
That same stomping ground. But the I would say that geez, we were talking.
I mean, because they are a product of the Beatles too. I mean, because the name Ramone was Paul McCartney's alias that he went under in the early days. When they would go check in at hotels and they didn't want to, and so he would go by Paul Ramone. And Dee Dee, the bass player, was such a big fan of that when they were tossing around ideas for the group, he's like, let's go with Ramones. And so, I mean, like you said before, the Beatles are on this album cover. The Ronettes are on this album cover. The Ronettes are on this album. Joey, they put "Baby I Love You" was on this album, and that actually did chart in the UK. It didn't do anything in this country. I mean, that was always funny about the Ramones, is they're like the most American band, but they never really had the success here. They did in Britain to a pretty good extent. South America, they were the Beatles of South America.
No kidding.
They were huge. Like
That's interesting. Yeah.
And it was almost like in in Latin America, they were going through their rock and roll revolution in the 80s and the 90s, that we had gone through in the 60s, the 50s and the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think it was partly a reaction to me never getting to see them live in concert, that I just kind of like
really?
covered myself in watching documentaries and video clips and everything like that. That I saw, I've seen images of them in South America just being like mobbed, having bodyguards, in the United States. Yeah, they had huge concerts. Like people would come out and see them, but it's just like, yeah, it's the Ramones. Like there's just those guys. Like,
yeah, sure.
They'll be back later this year.
It wasn't like, oh my God, it's George Michael. I can't.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of something.
that's yeah. He would, part of Wham. Wham's walking down the street. Like, yeah.
It's interesting talking about. I never really equated the Ramones with music that was earlier, but and you think about it, like, and you're saying the Beatles had some sort of an influence. Like the early Beatles albums actually do kind of remind me of this type of music. Before we got into like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, the early stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think when you go to like Rubber Soul is like when they started to change a little bit.
That's when the Beatles started to change. Yeah.
And the Beach Boys too. And actually, if you go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, they have this whole, part of the thing there is they'll you can like look up groups, and they do a thing where you can see the groups that like inspired them, and that you can hear it in their sound. And of course I clicked on the Ramones, and they showed the Beach Boys, and they played a Beach Boys song, and then the Ramones did a few similar songs as the Beach Boys. Like they both did Do You Want to Dance. It's not either of the group's original song, but they do, Do You Want to Dance. They did so later on in the 90s, they made an album called Acid Eaters, which is all about it's 60s cover songs. And they did, for the Japanese release of that, the Ramones did it was Surf and Safari. They did a version of it. But comparing this album cover with the Beach Boys, you can see some parallels, because for the first probably half of the 1960s, maybe a little bit longer, the Beach Boys had a uniform too. They were wearing those blue and white striped shirts.
Gosh. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
And then by the time you get to the end of the 60s, they look nothing like themselves.
They look like
Mike Love.
People.
Yeah. And Mike Love with his big beard, and and it's like, and when you see the group looking like that, singing their early 60s stuff, you're like, yeah, what is this? What's that guy doing? Like, what's that mountain man singing about surfing? Yeah, like, are they backstage? Is it like that Blues Traveler video? Like, what's going on here? And that would never happen for the Ramones. I mean, it was just, even when Dee Dee started to go a little bit rogue towards the end of the 80s,
I know,
he cut his hair all short and everything like that, it was still the Ramones, like unmistakable. They never like wandered around the stage and like, laughing at each other, like doing, it was always like both the guitarist and the bass player, regardless of who the bass player was, were always in, it was like very militaristic. Like they were just like, when I move forward, you move forward. When I move back, you move back. When I, just heads down, just playing their songs. And it was just like, it was perfect. And so that is represented on this album cover. I think the symmetry, you can see the four, group members essentially, yeah, actually not at all in the order that they usually are on stage, but you just have Dee Dee on the right side, looking at the stage, Dee Dee on the right, Johnny on the left, Joey in the middle, Marky in the background. It was around this time, shortly after this album, that they had some pretty famous live shows. One would be their appearance at the US Festival. And on that one, when you watch that, you can see Joey trying to be a lot more mobile. And like you're saying before, like this album seems to be that leaping off point where they're trying really hard to become like the other groups, like being something that they're not. And like Joey's kind of moving around the stage a little bit more than he did before or after. And but it just looks odd because it's not them.
It's almost like a failed paradigm shift,
Yeah.
like they tried, but they could only be themselves.
Kind of like when Jewel came out with that pop song. Do you remember that?
How dare you bring that name up? Yeah.
She's listening to this right now. She's like, what? Don't bring that up.
We'll be getting some hate mail now.
Right. So. Just from Jewel. So if you get anything postmarked from Alaska, you know who that's from. Yeah. I was trying to listen to that Ramones, podcast, but we get that far. But so the next question, and I think we've covered it pretty well, but we can tap into just one more, is why did they make it? And I think we covered why they made it, but what is the why did they make it? Tell us about that end of the 70s, early 80s. They recorded it in the spring of 1979. It gets released in February of 1980. Mm-hmm. The whole making it sound like that, what does that tell you about? Because I have a thought, but what does it tell you?
Well, the world was changing a bit. That's a weird period in time.
Yeah,
the late 70s into the early 80s, and then of course the later 80s. Even the sound of music was changing. I think what happened was, like, you had Van Halen came out, right?
Yeah,
and then there was all hair metal, and how do these guys fit in when everybody's supposed to have big hair and long, and like everybody's got the guitar solo guy,
Yeah.
So they're trying to probably find an identity within there that will work,
Yeah.
And I don't know, you had Bon Jovi and all those bands. They all looked exactly the same.
Yeah.
Didn't look or sound like those guys, you probably wouldn't make it on the radio. You had to be Poison, or you had to be Motley Crue. So I think maybe they were preparing for that shift. Maybe, because they weren't idiots, these guys,
Not at all.
That's another thing about punk rock, is that there's a misconception about it, is that these are just punk kids. Like the Sex Pistols are punk kids to me. They don't have anything to say. But the music of the Ramones has a lot to say. It's like stories, mm-hmm. or messages of, so I feel like this probably is their attempt to try to fit in some sense in that world.
Yeah. No, I'm with you on that. And and you talk about the shift that they're preparing for. Mm-hmm. It's almost like they're lobbing out their best guess. They're like, this is what we think the next decade is going to look like. Maybe, like they may as well be shrugging in that picture, be like, because going back to their status their status within rock and roll was very high by this point. They had already inspired dozens of bands across the country to form and to create music, and they were headlining their own shows. They weren't supporting anybody else by 1980. They had started in their own movie a couple years before, Rock and Roll High School. And actually right around this time, because that's why the song Rock and Roll High School is on this album. And so they were almost like doing all the things that those, like the Beatles or other early rock and roll groups would be doing, but rock and roll had kind of passed them by. Like, I don't think Van Halen ever, they made a movie for Van Halen, which I want to write one, like starting after we get off this call, but
I'll write one too. We'll compare. The interesting thing about the time period here is that Van Halen, the self-titled album, the one that exploded, music, inspired the entire 80s nonsense, came out in 1977.
Yeah.
So that might have been some sort of a thing where they were like, oh, something is going to change, because that album did change a lot.
Mhm.
It was the album. If you go back, I guess in periods of time, you have like different different genres that took over, you know, and maybe this again, this is their attempt to try to preserve in a sense, but also evolve in
Yeah,
some way.
and
But
and
they're
we're
still
we're
ultimately,
seeing it so well on this album cover represented because with their uh the colors of their t-shirts
mhm,
is almost looks like like when you look at a color wheel in art class, and you have like all the primary colors, they're not, and then black, Dee Dee's wearing black in
yeah,
the, and you have all these, and it's like they're not mixing the paints, they're not doing anything fancy, they're just getting ready to go to work with this new decade. And here's something I find interesting. So Van Halen and another big rock show band from the 70s, Kiss.
oh, of course, yeah,
And you can easily say that Kiss was like the original glam rock, that those hair groups from the 80s really were, pale comparisons to Kiss. But later on in the late 90s, I think it was, maybe early 2000s, they came out with a Ramones tribute album, and Kiss is on there playing the first track off of this album. They do their own version of Do You Remember Rock and Roll Radio, and it's fantastic, and
yeah. I
it's
thought they
almost
would
like
be a good
coming full
contributor.
circle.
That is cool, actually.
It was really good, and they featured it in the movie School of Rock, which has, in their montage scene, they use a Ramones song, not off this album. They use My Brain Is Hanging Upside Down from a later, but they show this incredible montage where Jack Black's character is like pointing at all the history of rock and roll, and you can see him like all the different branches off, kind of like what you're just talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
Like this is where this kind of music comes from, but
Is it?
all of it is a reflection of its time period. But this one, I really love what you had to say about that. That it's reflecting a time period that didn't exist.
Yeah,
Like they invented the time period themselves. They're like hovering above the 70s, like we're still kind of in the 50s and 60s. And then as they're approaching this new decade with a giant question mark hanging over it, they're like, yeah, let's just see what this one brings, and I think this might be the right look for it and the right sound. And
we'll try
you know
Phil Spector and see what he has. That's a crazy combination right there, Phil Spector and the Ramones.
yeah, and we don't have tons of time for it right now, but I guess some crazy stuff happened during the time that they were out west recording this, in that like they supposedly like they even made a couple years ago, they made a stage show about this in Chicago,
Oh, really?
called like Three Chords and a Gun or something like that.
Yeah, yeah,
and
sure.
and because I guess Phil Spector, as we have all found out, was a big gun enthusiast, and I guess some stories say that like he held them at gunpoint in his house and made them listen to music or something like that. And other reports, other band members say no, all he did was just show us his guns. He didn't hold anybody there. But
There is a story that he pulled the gun on John Lennon too. So, I
yeah,
think he probably pointed a few guns at some people anyway.
yeah, if he didn't seem like the most balanced person
No,
that you would necessarily, he's one of those artistic types that wants to make crazy stuff. So it was recorded in Hollywood. So the next question is, where was it made? And it was made in Hollywood, Los Angeles, California.
where were their earlier albums made?
So most of them, if I'm not mistaken, were produced in New York. And I was just going to say, the Ramones are New York. They're not,
Oh,
even
yeah.
though, two of the band members are buried in Los Angeles. Uh, the band is New York. Like when you think of New York, you think of the Yankees, you think of pizza, you think of the Ramones. They
Yeah,
are
really.
they are a total product of New York City, especially in the 70s.
Like if you took New York City at that time period and made it into a band, it would be them.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, they were just, I mean, because we see them, like I keep going back to it, the leather jackets. Yeah, leather jackets, Ramones. Like, but in that era, leather jacket, that was the look of like your regular street tough, somebody that might mug you, not necessarily, go on stage and sing a song, or shout a song, in their case. So it's funny because I feel like being at the same studio that produced Beach Boys records and Eddie Cochran stuff, which for them, aesthetically, that's a right place to be, but it's too bright and too bright and sunny for them, like
environment plays a huge part in the creative process for sure. Being in California, that's really different.
yeah. Like
from
when you're in New York City, you can totally understand how you go from hearing the sounds of machinery and traffic and just like you can be walking around the street in New York and all of a sudden, like out of some grate below you, you just hear like a, and you have no, and you're like, okay. And you can see that immediately go right over to just like Johnny Ramone's guitar. Like he's just producing the sounds that he hears every single day, being in Queens or being in Manhattan. Like that's that. Whereas Los Angeles, I mean, it has its gritty underbelly for sure. But you don't hear that. Like I don't hear that really. Sure. And I mean, you could, because in the same time period, it was the early part of the hardcore scene with Black Flag and the Germs and those groups out in LA. But being in a recording studio like Gold Star Studios in Hollywood, California, isn't the Ramones. And so right there, it's like, yeah, you're trying to go back in time, but you can't.
It's too bad because they were, in a way, I guess they were sort of preservationists, not in the sense of keeping the music of that alive, but making new music that was in the vein of the music.
They're like the Byzantine Empire of rock and roll, and I kind of say that kiddingly, but carrying the torch of the old empire into the new, maybe they did that for us. And think about how many candles they lit along the way with that torch, even if this album isn't exactly the one. So the other thing I should point out too, so the next question is, who's the intended audience or user of this? And this is a big loaded question for this particular album.
That is interesting,
because on the one hand they have their fans, and you can hear that in some of the songs that they included in there, including the return of Jackie and Judy, and they also have This Ain't Havana. Both of those songs are references to previous songs of theirs. So there's Jackie is a punk, or Judy is a punk, which as Jackie and Judy both mention it, Jackie is a punk, Judy is a run. And then the other song, Havana Affair, which came off of their first album, actually both those songs are revisited with those two other songs. So it's like a nod to their fans. The song Chinese Rock is, that was recorded by several artists, including, I think Johnny Thunders did a version of that, which is a nod to New York. It's to their scene. The Baby I Love You is another reference to New York, where the Ronettes are from, so it's all that stuff. But I think the Ronettes cover is their attempt once again to get new fans. Like, hey, we're not so bad. Like, just because we have this, look like we all carry switchblades, doesn't mean that you can't like us. Like we're from the 60s too. And so you got that going for them as far as so the intended audience, like, it's a mixed one, isn't it?
It is, because it's almost like they're trying to get like I said before, like a greater audience, like trying to bring in new people. But the thing is, like, I look at this album cover and I'm just like, it's kind of like one of those things, like you can take the tiger out of the jungle, but you can't take the jungle out of the tiger.
Yeah.
And so maybe they were trying to broaden their audience, of course, but at the same time, they're just themselves. They still wrote music the way that they could write music.
Yeah.
They weren't compromising to anybody, really.
What's funny is if you listen to some of their demo tracks, so they've come out with a couple other releases of the same album, like the 20th anniversary, the
Of
30th,
course, yeah. Remix,
and the
remastered.
demos for some of these songs are incredible because it
Yeah.
sounds like the first three albums.
Y-
It has like that very raw.
Just release the demos. That's what you should do. When they released "Let It Be" without the Phil Spector Wall of Sound stuff, the stripped down version. Let's get the demos and put that as a type a version of this album.
Yeah, and they sort of have, but and those ones are almost specifically for the fans.
Mm-hmm.
So like it's kind of funny because like this album was their attempt, and I think that the cover has so much to do with that, of being put onto record shelves, because I don't think by 1980 that most record stores had a punk section. I think they were just in general pop rock.
Yeah, I imagine so.
Like you probably couldn't even get. I mean, I wasn't even born yet, so I don't know, and I didn't start going to record shops until I was, at least like 11 or 12 years old. So, but I have a feeling that your, regular run of the mill record store didn't have a punk and hardcore section like you would find now.
It's crazy. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was just gonna say. So it's like they're trying to get like that clean cut as much as you can get clean cut for them. Look on there to try to call in that audience. Like the script on the So their previous albums, the first two. I mean, you can hear the album just by looking at them. Like the first one looks how it sounds,
Yeah.
And
like,
they
kind of like, what Star Wars, what's this movie about? Oh yeah, it's the same thing.
That original movie poster is like, yep. That checks out.
I get it.
And then by the time you get to Road to Ruin, where it's like a very, I love the artwork on that. It's like a hand drawn, it's a almost like comic, underground comic book kind of look to it. For that, it's very busy by comparison. The album itself is very busy. They have like country western sounds in that one. They try to do, and that's where I Want to Be Sedated came on. So they have some of their older sound to it, but they're trying new things. And then this one is just like that. All right, let's try to get some people, but just Johnny Ramone's face alone, I think may have been enough for people like grab the record, be like, I don't know, he looks like he's gonna punch me. Like
they're probably like, is this record gonna mug me?
Like, is it gonna somehow like reach out and do something? I don't know if I want to put this on.
Oh, no, he's right behind me, isn't he? It's like that kind of thing. It's cool. It's kind of sad in a way is that they inspired so many bands like Metallica were hugely inspired by the Ramones, big time. You wouldn't know to listen, but that style, that aggressive downstrokes that you get, that Johnny Ramone, the way that he played the guitar,
he basically invented it.
He did. He said, James Hetfield from Metallica, not to get into music and stuff, said that was the first time he heard that type of strumming, and he said, I'm going to do that. That's how I play. And so, you got these bands with all this huge notoriety, big, number one on the charts, that were inspired by these guys, but they didn't rise to that rank. It's a weird thing.
They're like a minor league pitching coach or something. Like they're given the tips, but they themselves, they retired from big leagues a long time ago, or they never even went. They just, because like Metallica, they for the 80s they had huge, heavy metal headbanging, fans following them, but the 90s they were on MTV, they were on regular radio, they were, they weren't the scary Metallica anymore. And
they had a successful paradigm shift.
So it goes right back to what we were saying. This album was just like they threw a dart and it didn't hit the bullseye, and it maybe not even hit the board. Like it was pointed, it had the right velocity, it made it there, but it just wasn't on point and on the mark as it should have been. And because oh, go ahead.
Saying back to like the first album, what you're going to hear. With this album, it's kind of like, I don't know, and it's kind of maybe a reflection of how they were at the time and how they're viewing the world going. Maybe it's kind of like, we're confused at this point, we're gonna try something different,
Yeah, but not too different, because especially Johnny, he kept going back and saying that the sound that they had on their first 2, maybe 3 albums is what he wanted to do forever. That he's like, that's us, like but if you just stay, like you said at the beginning of this, if you stay the same, you're going to eventually lose, people are like, do something different,
Yeah.
and so then you do something different and people are like, why can't you stay the same? Why do you keep messing with us? This album, I'm thinking about the punk rock fans, so the intended audience, and they're of course going to buy it, so they're hoping to get new fans with the look. But it reminds me of a story I heard a long time ago about from, actually, I think Little Richard himself told the story where he said teenagers back in the 50s would buy Tutti Frutti, his album.
Yeah, sure.
But because the parents oftentimes in suburbia found it unacceptable to have somebody who looked like Little Richard on their album cover, they would buy the Pat Boone version as well. And so they would have the Pat Boone sleeve out. So when mom and dad came over, what are you listening to? They could just hold that up and be like, because they would hear the words Tutti Frutti. They're like, it's this guy. And they're like, well, he looks wholesome. So, go back to. So I wonder if it's kind of along the same lines as that, where, in 1980, I don't have a full discography of all the punk and hardcore stuff coming out, but you could be listening to X, you could be listening to, much harder stuff than the Ramones, and, mom and dad, looking at your record collection and be like, oh, these guys look all right. Like, I don't approve of their hair, but
well,
they all
that
hang out.
Approved of the Beatles hair either, so it's like, well, maybe they're onto something. Maybe this is what the kids are doing now. I guess it's weird. I don't get it, but
I'm willing to negotiate on hair length, but if they start wearing leather jackets,
yeah,
then they look like all those other groups, because that had become a staple of so many of the punk bands. I mean, think about Joan Jett, right? You brought her up before. With the Runaways, she had that look. They toured with the Ramones in the 70s. What a bill that must have been to see the Runaways and the Ramones
at that time too.
Oh, at the peak of both. And so she, after the Runaways broke up, Lita Ford went the heavy metal route, and Joan Jett stayed more punk. And I believe it's her first album, she ditches her trademark leather jacket and is wearing that like purple like blazer thing, and she does Tommy James and the Shondells cover, Crimson and Clover on that album, and even I Love Rock and Roll is a cover song too. And it's kind of, and that album cover, you could probably hold it right up to End of the Century and it looks so similar. It's just her, plain background. She's not like mugging for the camera, she's not flipping the bird or anything like that. It's just very much like, I mean, she's rock and roll, you can tell she's rock and roll with her eyeliner and her hair, but it's not as extreme as maybe what the parents are expecting,
right?
And that says a lot about the time period too. I mean, kids, the late 70s with divorce rates on the rise, part of the reason why the hardcore scene grew in Southern California the way it did was because of kids being left to their own devices for hours at a time. Their parents, if they had two parents, were both working, and some of them long hours, and a lot of single parents. And so the kids are just kind of left to run wild, and they were looking for something to do and to, I mean, that's even a title of a song, I just want to have something to do, for the Ramones. But and so they could be picking up something that looks really dangerous and menacing. But the most menacing thing of this album on this one is Johnny Ramone's face. That's it. The rest of it looks pretty good. It's not too bad.
It's reasonable. If I put my thumb over it, they look like a reasonable bunch of young fellas.
Yeah, like not too bad. Like they nothing that you should get too alarmed by, because especially compared to this other group, look at these guys.
Yeah, like the Metallic album where they have, a like a hammer, a bloody hammer and chisel on the cover. It's like,
Right.
yeah, that's what you want to bring home to mom.
So what a great opportunity for America's teenagers at the end of the 70s and 80s. They can be like, the content of these albums is very similar, but I can hold up the cover art and say, all right, what would you rather me listening to? Black Flag where the guy's, punching the mirror, or these guys that look like, just, kind of goofy looking fellas with their, red and yellow and blue shirts on,
like we have the plainest colors of all, the most just bland stuff, regular old reds and blacks.
Yeah, not even striped, just very solid. And
you don't get a picture of anything on that t-shirt. It's just bland.
Yeah. And
yeah, that's I find that fascinating, the whole idea of where they were at the time and where they were headed, I guess.
Yeah,
it was a big unknown there, because you did have new wave coming out, and there are all these new things happening, and where do you guys fit in?
And they look very new wave here. It's amazing how just letting the jacket go can really change everything, because new wave was the diet Pepsi of punk. It was meant to be the more radio friendly, the more TV friendly, that you could put some of these groups on the TV or on the radio and it wouldn't blow up the speakers. And I mean that's the first thing that they point out on this album, End of the Century, and that's maybe even why they're calling it the End of the Century. They're like, rock and roll, unless we do something right now, we'll be gone forever.
It's all going to be keyboards,
and it's all going to be synthesizers, and it's we need change and we need it fast, right? Before rock's part of the past. And so it's like they're not joining them, they're trying to beat them. It's not the but it's in doing so, by taking away that leather jacket, it's they're no longer, they kind of lose their power a little bit.
Yeah.
So the next, there's two more questions left, and I think we've touched on quite a bit of it already, and we can kind of combine these two. So the next one is, what ideas or behavior does this convey? So if you're wondering our answers to that, just think of the last 40 minutes. We've extended that quite a bit. And the last question, is it prescriptive or descriptive? And like any good album cover, I mean, the whole idea of an album cover was really born in the mid 60s. Like I said before, Rubber Soul is one that stands out.
Yeah,
Pet Sounds. I mean, because the whole concept of, I'll use that word again, concept album, where you have from start to finish, that you wrote the album. You're not just collecting a bunch of songs and putting them together, that you wrote the album and arranged it the way you want it to be. That was born in the 60s. And before that, a lot of groups would just have like a more or less like a interchangeable photograph of them, just kind of, and then and then here's all of the EPs put together, all the singles, just for the first time on one record, you can listen. And so by the time you get to the 70s and 80s, the album cover is just as necessary as any other component to express. A few podcasts ago, I talked about the book cover to The Great Gatsby, and how that was kind of a novel thing, and novel thing in the 20s, of having graphic design to sell your book and to communicate what's inside the book. And so by the rock and roll was kind of late to that, as far as like designing your album cover to communicate to this growing market of listeners what is on it. Because I'm sure some record stores had listening rooms, but if this is a group that's not even on the radio, how are you going to know what's on that record until you bring it home and listen to it?
Yeah, it's true. And I think maybe they were just lost in the mix or something, because like I said, there's a lot of stuff going on, and you know what's crazy too is that their songs are hilarious. They're hilarious.
Yeah.
You know, I, there were no bands writing songs like with lyrics like that. You know, they're just kind of goofy, and sometimes they're poignant at the same time, and
Mhm.
they come from the. I don't know, but I think they this it kind of makes me sad, this album cover, in a way. You know,
Like a surrendering in a way,
you
or
know, in kind of like what is my identity now?
yeah.
You know, and they're trying this like as a new thing, but at the same time, maybe they're a little unsure about it. Like it, it's scary of doing, you know, doing something new or doing something different than the way you've done it in
Yeah.
the past. So um
Have you ever seen that movie Bring It On?
no, I haven't.
With, and it actually has there's a punk rock character in it. The one of, but I actually love that movie, and maybe a future podcast will be about Bring It On. But it it's about these cheerleaders who year after year they win the championship, and then
Oh,
they
right,
find
right.
out, it turns out they've been stealing their moves from a inner city cheerleading squad, unbeknownst to them. Like their cheer captain had been videotaping this other group covertly, and then teaching her squad how to do it. So they, in an attempt to reinvent themselves so that they can have a better chance of winning, they end up hiring this guy named Sparky Pilastri, who
Oh, that's
claims to be like, he's like, I can, you know, make your cheer squad, you know, great. And he like, turns out he's like marketing it all over the place. And so I'm wondering if like Phil Spector was kind of like the Sparky Pilastri of rock and roll. Like, why Ramones? Why did you, like, we know that you're a throwback band. We know that you're getting so much inspiration from the 60s, but at the edge of this new era,
mm,
why did you go to that guy? You know, he's not going to be the magic
maybe.
producer for the 80s. Like, he's not going to set you, you know, he may have been good 15 years ago, but now is not the time to turn to him. So, you know, just like they learn and Bring It On, Sparky Pilastri is just gonna screw you over.
You know, I can understand why they might have been drawn to Phil Spector, because they love the music that he had produced in the past. You know, so it's like, oh my God, this is the big deal. We got Phil Spector on our team. You know, it's just not the right producer
Yeah.
for that. It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, the 70s were very much a lost era.
Mm.
You know, it was a gloomy time for the country. There was a lot, you know, and by the end of the century, I think people that this album cover shows a lot of exhaustion as well, you know, and I think a lot of people were exhausted and
Mm.
ready for a new era to begin, hopefully a good one. And that you can read it on their face a bit, that this
I
is
think so.
their, you know, they're feeling it too, that they're just kind of
They
like,
don't.
yeah.
They kind of don't look like they're posing at all. They look like they just kind of group together. They're like, everyone stand over here. You know,
Yeah.
they're not. They don't mug. You know, they just are themselves.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. It's not Kiss Destroyer where they're
Mm.
screaming and like holding out, you know, hand gestures and there's a big explosion behind them, or
Yeah.
and really on none of their albums do you find them giving very much expression at all. Like that's not them. They were just like, you know, and they almost had like this idea of like, we're just part of your day. We shouldn't be rock stars, you know, to, you know, it's like, we're just like, when they would do a show, it was like, yeah, 30 minutes of music, that's it. You know, and it's like, we're up here, we're just gonna play our music. You know, it's just part of your routine. You know, go out, do some shopping, go see the Ramones, go back, have some dinner, go see a movie, you know, just like not to make themselves anything that they're not. A lot of the fans point out at, there's a show that they did in Ann Arbor, Michigan, in support of this album, that a lot of fans point out is like their best show. That something about the chemistry of the group, their set list, Joey's voice.
Mm.
If you ever get a chance to watch there's a really good recording of it you feel like it was very like intimate setting. Like it wasn't a big arena or a concert hall or anything like that. It was like a really small club, and you feel like you're in that
Like
show.
you put the headphones on, you can hear the room almost. Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
And what's funny is that and I've watched dozens of Ramones concerts on, because I never got to see them live. So, and they always shed their leather jackets at some point.
Really?
They start every and usually their first songs, their set list, they'll go to their first couple albums for the first songs on the set list. Blitzkrieg Bop is always up there, early on in the show to get things going. But it's usually about a dozen songs in or so, maybe even less, that they get uncomfortable, they get hot, and they take off their leather jackets. And I just kind of occurring to me now that this album, the fourth album into their career, it's like being a quarter of the way through a concert, they're taking off their jackets and they're just saying, all right, we're gonna, we still got about 3/4 of a show left, but this is that point. So it's almost like bringing the experience of a live concert just stretched out over 6 years.
And another thing about them too, just in general, the Ramones, is that they had, I won't say humility, they're humble people, in an era when everybody was so big.
Yeah.
Everything was getting bigger, and they weren't like, pyrotechnics and stuff like that. Like you're saying, you just go out, play the music, off stage. It's about the music.
Like when they left the stage at their last concert, just thank you, good night.
Yeah,
and they're done. That's what you get, and it's like it matches. And we're gonna finish with I think you said it so perfectly earlier on, that they're a primary source of an era that never existed. And so therefore there's nobody that can ever match them. And even if they're trying really hard on this album, I don't even know if it was them. I think it was probably the marketing department of Sire Records. They're like, no, why don't you lose the jackets? Why don't you? I wonder what would be different for them.
Yeah, sure.
Would their fortunes have been different had they? Because you can see there's photographs of the ones with the jackets.
Mm-hmm.
And even the inside, like I had the CD growing up, and like the inside shows like a stylized picture of them with the leather jackets on, the same pose.
Yeah.
And it's like, what would have happened if that was the album cover?
Yeah.
It would have changed anything, would have reached the attention, because I could picture some, teenagers that are listening to Van Halen by 1980. Mm-hmm. And are like looking through the records and new releases, and this does not, for the very reason they're trying to capture a new fan base, this does not catch their attention, because this looks like something their parents would be listening to.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
So had they kept the leather jackets on, maybe made a little bit more exciting album cover, maybe we would not be talking about them almost like, oh, what could have been.
Yeah, there's the album cover, and then there's Phil Spector. There's like two factors there that but I think the album cover is significant in their identity, and
mm-hmm.
and also just like kind of uncertainty about like the 70s into the 80s. That period of time was just so tumultuous.
Yeah, I always get a kick out of it seems like the 20th century was the first time that people were really cognizant of breaking things down into 10-year increments, as if, like, because that's never happened. And, we don't actually do that. When we cross over from 1999, well, actually that's a bad example, because that was pretty exciting when Y2K, but when you cross over from 1989 into 90, let's say, it's not like everything changes with like a flip of a switch. It's not like all of a sudden it's end of one period and on to a new one.
They sort of crash into each other. You get a little bit
of
some of the hair metal, he crossed
Yeah.
over and died.
Like things just don't disappear. It's like, because people continue on, they might evolve slightly differently. So, but I feel like that's such a 20th century thing. It's like so industrial or post-industrial, where everything is just like, we will take life on in 10-year increments, like this unit of time. And so everyone's aware, as oh, years that end in 3s and 7s, those aren't exciting, those are boring. But if it ends in a 0, oh man, you have to make a statement, and you have to be totally aware of what's going on around you, and you have to make some kind of preparation for what's to come. And I think we can end things by saying, I think the Ramones, and I'll say this at the end, my all-time favorite anything, not just music. They are the reason I like that.
Sure.
They speak to me. Like, they are just like, if I could put my entire being into a group, they are it. Like, this is like, if you want to know who I am, listen to the Ramones. Like, that's me. And so it's I'm not at all putting them down for this. It was just like, this is just one of those, another hallmark of them just being out of step, just barely out of step.
Yeah, I would say I agree.
So hopefully we didn't throw anybody a major curveball by talking about the album cover more than the actual music itself. But that is the essence of this podcast. I really appreciate you coming on and breaking down such a specific thing with me.
It's a great time.
And I hope we can do it again, because one of the things I've been reflecting on over the last few months since I started this podcast is like, I didn't make friends for a podcast, because I've been having, but I feel like giving myself a pat on the back. I'm like, I've made a lot of great friends over the years, very interesting people with a wonderful wide array of things to talk about and to think about. You're all deep thinkers and
you should
ponderers.
introduce to some of those people.
I couldn't think of anybody else but you to talk about this kind of thing with, because you have such a wonderful mind for just the slightest sound of a chord or a note. You'll think about it, and it'll resonate with you.
Yeah, and I really I'm glad that we were able to do this subject, because it's something that is very close to you, yourself. So
yeah, it's and I'm glad I was able to get inspired by it. Like I said, I follow the number of Ramones things on social media, and it just kind of came up. I'm like, you know what, that's really good. I like that idea of a turning point for the group, even if it wasn't a welcome one. It was a turning point for them.
Perfect album to pick, honestly. Yeah. This is a perfect album to pick.
So we've had it for the last 42 years with us, and I don't know if anybody else has ever done a podcast on the cover art, but I'm glad we did. And so thanks again. And, thank you all for listening to this. And just remember, you can find the EPS podcast all over social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. There is a Patreon page where we have products that you can get if you become a patron of the show. Everything from stickers, mugs, and t-shirts are in store for you if you were so nice to support the show through monthly donations. So thank you, Kris, for joining the EPS podcast, where everything, including the cover photograph for the Ramones' End of the Century 1980, is a primary source. We'll talk to you next time.